We're 100 days into Donald Trump's second presidency, and Axios is hitting him hard with this headline. Quote, exclusive. Most Americans see Trump as dangerous dictator, poll says. We're going to get into all of the polling about Trump's approval rating as we hit the 100-day mark, but I wanted to start with this because it's a splashy headline that's going viral, as you can imagine, on social media. And I think actually digging into this poll is a good place to start with the Trump administration in general. So this was a poll done by the Public Religion Research Institute. It's called PRRI. You've probably seen polls from them before. They're technically nonpartisan. I honestly would quibble with some of the wording in the questions in this very exhaustive, very long survey. And actually, one of the questions I would quibble with is the one that got the headline here. And let's just explain why I have a quibble with it. First of all, it's right, as Axios said, the PRRI poll did find a majority of Americans say President Trump is a, quote, dangerous dictator. So 52% agreed that Trump is, quote, a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. But if you look at the poll, the alternative in that particular question, and this is why it's always important to look at the poll itself before just taking headlines like that. It gave you two options. I mean, technically it gave you three options, but just as I'm pulling this up here, um, it gave you could choose either that one that I just read out. So if you agreed with President Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy, you were in that group of 52%. But if you agreed with the statement, quote, President Trump is a strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness, you were in 44%. Now, you could choose to skip the question, but those are the two options that are presented with you. So that you're presented with. And so you're looking at these two questions as you're taking a poll, asked to agree. President Trump is a blank. Statement one, dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before it destroys American democracy. Statement two, strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness. And then you can just choose to skip it. But skipping, when you're taking polls or clicking through polls, you're clicking answers. And so actually, in this one, there was 4% of people who chose to skip the question, but basically, I think it's a little bit reckless. I would actually even quibble with Axios here. I think it's a little reckless to run with that headline, given that these are your two options. Now, do I still think that it's interesting? 52% of people agreed that Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. Yes, I do think that's interesting. 52% of people thought that more than Trump is a, quote, strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness. But basically what that question is asking you is to either be in the hardcore MAGA camp or the hardcore anti-MAGA camp. And most Americans are somewhere in the middle as Trump hits his 100-day mark. I'm going to get into that in just a moment because the numbers aren't great for Donald Trump. Well, recession concerns are making headlines again, and experts, of course, are paying attention. Jim Walker, the economist who predicted the 2008 market crash, recently said he'd be amazed if a recession can be avoided. For those in or nearing retirement, this economic uncertainty is a real concern, very real. When the dollar declines and markets become volatile, traditional retirement strategies can be exposed, unfortunately. That's why more people are exploring gold IRAs. It's a way to include physical gold in your retirement portfolio. Historically, gold has maintained its value during recessions and periods of inflation, offering a potential hedge against economic downturns. This video is proudly sponsored by Augusta Precious Metals, who've put together a free gold IRA guide to help you understand how it works, why it matters, and whether it's the right fit for you and your financial goals. Gold IRAs are specifically for funds that are already held in a qualified retirement account like an IRA or a 401k. Big thanks to Augusta Precious Metals for supporting this video and for making this resource available for free. If gold is piquing your interest, you can download your free guide by clicking the link below. But I do just briefly want to dwell on this a little bit more because, again, this happens in polling a lot. You get a a question that's sort of a black and white type of thing, and there's no like neutral third option. And you can scroll to the bottom and click skip. But as you're going through polls, people are just going to answer as best they can. And if people think that his power should be limited because that was part of the question, then you end up just clicking something like that. Now, the margin of sampling error is plus or minus 1.69 percentage points. That's uh, pretty low. And this was taken from February 28th to March 20th. So that's actually before quote unquote Liberation Day and the tariff madness. It's right around the time where we're starting to see some significant immigration movement. But I actually suspect, given the coverage of tariffs and cases like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, that number of 52% would be higher because more people right now probably are willing to, if it had been taken at a later date, are willing to agree with the statement that Trump's power should be limited before he destroys American democracy, even if they don't agree with the label dangerous dictator. When the only other alternative they're presented with is, quote, President Trump is a strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness. Just really, I mean, I think that's I mean, I suppose people might be curious to see what the average American responds when presented with those two options, but I think people are inclined to choose the most anti-Trump possible option in this case, because it's like a black or white. It's yes or no, and if you cover surveys and polling long enough, you see how people's opinions change based on the wording. It's really, really powerful. And so I know this poll is getting a lot of attention and just wanted to dive into the particulars of that question, because I don't necessarily think that's a super responsible headline. That said, let's take a look at some polling averages now that we are 100 days into the Trump presidency. And by the way, publishing that publishing that around the 100-day mark without mentioning like right up top in an article, this is just another thought I have before we move on quickly. It should be really clear, not way down at the bottom of the article, that this was taken. The last person in the survey was asked more than a month ago, what they what they thought about all of these questions. This stuff changes by the day, let alone the month. So let's turn to President Trump's job approval average over at Real Clear Politics. And not just Real Clear Politics, we're also going to take a look at Silver Bulletin, that's Nate Silver, obviously, and the New York Times. And what you'll notice is all three of these make the exact same shape, and it is an X. So that's very consistent across these polling averages. And if we start with RCP, you see Trump began his presidency actually above water. So he was at a little over 50% approval, close to 44% disapproval. That right around early March starts to flip. And I have a theory why that's a little bit different from some of the media coverage that we've gotten, particularly because when you look across these polling averages, we can check out the Silver Bulletin one. Then we can check out also the Upshot. So this is the New York Times polling average. It all happens around the exact same time. It's around March 9th, March 10th, somewhere in there. And that's where the X starts to become an X, where approval starts to dip lower than disapproval, and they continue to go on their paths in separate directions. What Trump isn't going to want to do is look back in the next 100 days and see sort of like an alligator mouth, where you had this brief period where his approval was up and disapproval was down, and then this yawning chasm that looks like Jaws. But for now, he's got that X, and the X comes again early March, and right now he's at disapproval 52%. So that's higher, according to RCP, than where his approval was on the day of his inauguration. And then his approval now is at 45%, which is slightly higher than his disapproval was when he was inaugurated. So this is basically a reversal of where he was on day one of the first 100 days. And if we take a look at Silver Bulletin, we're seeing something really similar, about 52% approval, 40% disapproval on inauguration day, about 53% disapproval now, and 43% approval. And the PRRI poll that we mentioned earlier also finds about 4 in 10 say they approve of the job that Trump is doing as president. So 43%, which you'll notice is basically exactly where these most of these polling aggregates are around. Silver Bulletin has it at 43.8%, Real Clear Politics has approval at 45.3%, and New York Times Upshot has approval at 44%. So that is consistent, not just across polls, but across these polling averages. Basically, we've seen a flip-flop of American sentiment. Country's still obviously very divided. 44% is a big number by modern standards. He's not dipping down into the 30s quite yet, although the trend line isn't good. The trend line is going obviously in the opposite direction, as we just talked about. It could get into, alligator yawning jaw territory, and that's certainly possible. So the trend line is negative, but it's not the it's not as bad as it could be, let's put it that way, for an administration that has, by its own admission, undertaken a real shock to the system, an attempt at like a total course correction by some really dramatic means. And again, that is by this administration's own admission. If a representative from the White House were sitting here next to me, they would not deny that they were intentionally undertaking a dramatic project to reverse what they see as the course of the country. We're talking about things like getting rid of the Department of Education entirely. This is something that process is actually in motion. Firing all kinds of federal workers, at least attempting to do mass deportations, getting rid of things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and USAID. These are, again, very, very dramatic undertakings. And so listen, 44% is not good. The only point I'm making here is that when you are doing this, and of course you have to add in that the media depicts it all in a way that's anti-Trump. Doesn't mean the media is not trying a little bit harder, to be fair. But when the media depicts it in a way that is generally coming from a place of opposition to Donald Trump, the president, then of course it could be worse. 44% actually. You could imagine that being 10 points lower with a normal president, let's just say like a more cookie cutter Republican who comes in, gets rid of the Department of Education and the CFPB, and the media has a freak out, even if most Americans, with the facts presented in front of them, wouldn't be freaked out about it, even if you just like stipulated that hypothetically. These numbers could be, I would say, 10 points lower. So trend line not good. Could be worse, given the dramatic steps that Donald Trump has taken just in the first 100 days of his presidency. No surprise that you see basically a flip-flop on that. But to this point about timing. So when these converge, where these lines converge is on March 11th in the Upshot. They both hit 48%. Very interesting. March 11th in Silver Bulletin. Exact same thing. That's where they finally converge at 48%. In Real Clear Politics, they converge also at the 48% mark on March 11th. That's where these lines finally cross. And what I find interesting about that is it's before Liberation Day, right? Because now what most people are baking into Trump's 44% approval rating, roughly, give or take his 44, 45% approval rating, if you take all of these polling aggregates and you look at where they are, people say Liberation Day. And Liberation Day, the gap does absolutely start to really open up. You start to see some real distance or some real fuel to both of those numbers, and some real distance start to open up between the gap. But these numbers, again, the trajectory is set earlier than that. This is a pretty steady incline in disapproval and a pretty steady decline in approval, starting from Inauguration Day, evening out a little bit in the middle, but then especially accelerating after quote unquote Liberation Day. So there's no doubt that poured fuel on the fire of that trend line. But my theory is that, what was really big in the headlines leading up to that day where these lines finally crossed, and they haven't, reversed course since, is Elon Musk and Doge. If I think back to early March, what I think of immediately that was in the news constantly was Elon Musk and Doge. And what Democrats are having success with right now is not the performative, Alyssa Slotkin, F-bombs that she's been experimenting with in the press recently, or Hakeem Jeffries and Cory Booker hanging out on the steps of the Capitol just chatting, with activists. Like, that's not what's working. What's working is Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez going on a quote fighting oligarchy tour. You'll remember here on this show we had Dave Weigel from Semaphore, fresh off of reporting back from those rallies, talk to us about how what they were gathering was quote unquote normie Dems to come to these rallies, some of them which, by the way, were in red states. So I think that, I mean, that's, to me, significant that the trend lines were happening as the top story every day in the news was Doge. And Doge, by the way, was having effects around the country. I think something like 20% of federal workers are in the DC area. This is not, any statement on the given policies. We've done many episodes of Doge, but the politics of those policies and just trying to explain where these trends may have come from. And I think what gives credence to that is that Elon Musk is now stepping back. And when Elon Musk decided to step back came after that April 1st Wisconsin election, which actually Undercurrents was on the ground for. We did an episode from Wisconsin after that happened. And that was April 1st. So it's also, shortly before Liberation Day and after after these lines had already crossed and the trend lines were pretty set. But at the same time, it's coming off of, at that point, a couple months of pretty frantic Doge coverage. And again, this is not a statement on that coverage or on the policies, just an explanation of what people may have been reacting to. And because Doge was something that did affect the jobs of people around the country, again, not just here in the Washington area, but, people's Social Security, there's lots of reports of people's attempts to, fix their Social Security, reach Social Security, being disrupted, veterans' health being disrupted. I don't necessarily know that this is a reflection of people being upset about USAID so much as I think those early weeks of the Trump administration were heavily dominated with a media fixation on something that does genuinely bother the public. Not to say the media wouldn't have any role in manipulating public opinion by focusing a lot on this, but I do think it genuinely bothered the public that Elon Musk was given such a huge role in the early days of the Trump administration. When Trump won, Doge was supposed to be an outside advisory group. And Vivek Ramaswamy was supposed to be part of it. It wasn't just Elon Musk. And then when Trump came into office, they immediately took over the USDS, the US Digital Service. So a formal office, part of the government. Elon Musk became a special government employee. And I just think this was a story that people were legitimately upset about. I think that's why Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez focused so heavily on Elon Musk, the figure of Elon Musk, and were able to draw out tens of thousands of people, some in red states, because of that. To me, Donald Trump's success was built in 2015, 2016. Even the fact that he still got a lot of votes in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic was built on this idea that he was, quote, draining the swamp, right? That he was the man who was standing up against the elites. This sounds so obvious because we all know it. And I think Elon Musk really took the wind out of those sails. And it's not to say that Musk, doesn't have plenty of his own enemies in the American elite. But the idea of the most powerful businessman in the entire world, arguably the most powerful man in the entire world, other than the United States president, coming into office and basically just taking over the project of government reform with very little oversight, other than, again, the president himself. It seemed as though Elon Musk was not answering to literally anyone other than Donald Trump. You'll remember that joint interview they did on Sean Hannity's show around this time. Um, I think that really bothered people, not just Trump voters, but Trump's numbers with independents right now, I think are really noteworthy. That's something that is worth keeping in mind. It's Trump voters, PRRI, did ask a question about people who regret their vote in the 2024 presidential election. Um, only, let's say, yeah, so only 7% of Trump voters said they were either somewhat regretful or very regretful of their vote. The number of Kamala Harris voters in that camp is looks like it's 2-3%. Third party voters around 14%. And of non voters, there were, yeah, about 30% who say that they were somewhat regretful or very regretful of their vote decision in the 2024 presidential election, so of not to vote, apparently. And 72% of Trump voters say they are very satisfied. 20% say they're somewhat satisfied. Of Harris voters, 81% say they're very satisfied. 14% say somewhat satisfied. So most of the country is pretty satisfied with how they voted in the election. 7% though of Trump voters is an interesting number, saying they're somewhat regretful or very regretful in close elections. That's not insignificant. But most Trump voters are pretty happy with the way the administration has gone so far, with those satisfaction numbers where they are. But those independents, I think, is what's really, really worth paying attention to right now. I think you can see in the polling, that's where a lot of the bleeding is coming from in the Trump administration so far. This is, I will say, the New York Times says here, this is in their when in the upshot they say, quote, "It is typical for new presidents to experience a meaningful decline in support in the first few months of their presidency. Trump's approval rating has been dropping slightly faster than his recent predecessors, but the pace of the decline is not unprecedented." And the reason I thought that was worth noting is, as we are talking about before, these numbers, given the scope of the project that Trump is undertaking right now, are they actually could be worse. So these numbers are not the end of the world, and these trends can certainly be reversed for Trump and for the Trump administration. But there are a lot of people looking around, independent voters who went for Trump, that are likely uncomfortable with some things. And my theory here is that probably the biggest reason independent voters are uncomfortable, yes, there's the tariffs, but I think what started Trump on this course was Elon Musk and the Doge project becoming what it became. I don't think that had to happen. I think if, in an alternative world, you had Vivek and Elon Musk running this advisory committee from the outside that was making recommendations to the Office of Management and Budget, there still would have been a media firestorm over it just about every single day. But it would have been different. It wouldn't have been the sort of oligarch himself meddling in government affairs, some of which are affecting his portfolio on a significant basis. So we're 100 days into the Trump administration, and what a wild ride it has been. If you've been with us from the beginning, we came here between the RNC and the DNC. We were here on election night, here on Inauguration Day, and just looking back, just a crazy, crazy year. And these first 100 days, it was like, in a sense, very similar to 2017 when Trump came into office, and just operates at a totally different pace. But one big miss for him that we haven't talked about yet is he's says that he's the president of peace. He secured a ceasefire that fell apart in Israel and Gaza. He said he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Both of those conflicts are pretty clearly still hot. So that's another thing that might be giving some people pause with this administration. It hasn't been able to wind that or unwind those conflicts quite as easily as he said he was. Now, I don't think voters took him completely literally. I think people know that with Trump, but at the same time, this is the first 100-day mark. That is significant. So for him, you can tell it's a priority to start making significant progress. I think he's made significant progress in Ukraine. We have the outline of a potential deal at this point, but He's got to turn these numbers around. If Republicans, who I don't think they don't really expect to have government after the midterms. I think they expect to at least lose the House. But if that's the case and these numbers don't turn around, things like codifying some of these cuts to, let's say, the CFPB or USAID or the Department of Education into law with congressional legislation, that becomes really difficult to do. And Democrats can essentially come back into office and change when there's no longer a Republican president. You can issue executive orders that kind of unroll what the Trump administration did. So if the numbers don't turn around, it's going to get harder, first of all, before the midterms for members of Congress to keep aligning with Donald Trump. There's not going to be a ton of distance between them, but whether he runs for a third term, as he's been flirting with the new Trump 2028 hats that we've seen some of his we've seen his sons sporting in recent days, he's maybe toying with that as a way to maybe he doesn't. I mean, I think again, you always have to take him seriously. You don't necessarily need to take him literally, as the saying goes, but take him seriously. Maybe it's also a way to get congressional Republicans to stick near him, because once again, they know that they will find primary challenges that are very difficult if they don't stick with Donald Trump. And that way you can get them to keep voting with Trump into the midterms and potentially beyond the midterms, even if the politics and their sort of permission structures in their home districts shift a little bit. Who knows? There's so much to come. The reconciliation bill is on the table. There's a possibility of tax hikes for millionaires, something Republicans have virtually never talked about. The Trump tax cuts are on the table. Codifying this stuff into Congress is on the table. So there's much more to come in the next 100 days and beyond, and we'll be here for it. So thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want a premium version of the show, you can go over to undercurrents.tv. You get a weekly email from me. You get a private email address to communicate with us. And of course, you get premium weekly episodes, paywalled for subscribers only. Again, that's over at undercurrents.tv. We'll see you back here soon.